This is lesson 42. We had one lesson that was long enough. We split it up into two lessons, two parts. And I think we'll be doing this with this lesson as well. But we have biblical hermeneutics, and we'll be in lesson 42 of your outline book at least. And we'll relate to parables. This is a very important technique of teaching that Jesus used. He's the primary one that used parables in the Bible. And it's important that we understand both the nature of parables and how to interpret them, because we can sure get misled if we're not using good techniques for hermeneutics. We're going to give some background information that I believe, will aid us in our interpretation of the parables of the scriptures. I think they're a very powerful method of teaching. They have a lot of big advantages in the teaching process. The ancient people, and we're talking about people of biblical times, grouped the similitude under the heading of parables. So they grouped that under that heading of the word that they showed that they used. We get the word parable from which you get the word parable. And once we look at the Greek word and see what it means, we'll see why they did this. All right. We're going to give, I'm giving us further subdivisions of these figures of speech, because I'll separate the similitude and the simile, and even the metaphors, we'll separate them out into a separate category. We'll subdivide a little more than they did. I'll consider a parable to be a different figure of speech than a simile or a similitude. I'll make them argue that they're different. Look at the lexical definitions, and then we'll just look at them as extended similes with the following attributes. Jesus is the main person in the Bible who used parables to teach. Kind of remember that. Lord's parables are well known, and they're very effective in teaching the truth. I would like to have a class where we looked at all the parables of the Lord's parables and dealt with each one of them all the way through. I think that would be a very fruitful class. I have to prepare my materials though to get it done right. I want to translate them and look at them and study them and digest them. I think they're very rich, and they're a very powerful means of teaching. What did you say, Richard?
I was going to say a little side note for those interested. The GBN, the Church of Christ Bible Network, Gospel Broadcasting Network, they have a series of lessons out there that you can look at free of charge online that are about the Lord's parables. I think there's 23 different lessons out there.
Yeah.
From back in, I think they put them together mostly back in the late 90s. But I know that would probably be a good source if anybody just wants to go and look at and hear some information and kind of get a leg up on it.
Well, that probably some good materials there. Okay. All right, thank you. Webster defines a parable as originate comparison or similitude. Okay, that's what he defines it as. Parabole is the Greek word. We get our word parable in English. It's a placing of one thing by the side of another, or juxtaposition as of ships in a battle. It's a metaphor. Metaphorically, the word means a comparison of a thing with another, a likeness or a similitude. So even Thayer defines it as a similitude. But think of it like we have two words here, and the first four letters of para is the word beside in Greek. Mole is something thrust or thrown. So we throw or lay or put two things beside one another for comparison purposes. That's what the word parable actually means. Well, a simile does that too, makes a comparison. The parable is derived from two Greek words, para, meaning beside or with, and balo. Balo is the verb form. And they just drop the omega and put an eta in there and make it a noun. Pronounced balo, meaning to throw or cast. A parable is something thrust or thrown beside something else for comparison purposes. So we're making a comparison. So we have to look at what the comparison is, usually taking something that did happen and it was well known, and he laid beside it, took that physical thing, and then something that was well known, and then he laid beside it to teach a spiritual truth from it. That's we look at them. It's also Brown Driver Briggs Eusebius is that this is in the Hebrew Old Testament. It's a proverb or a parable of sentences constructed in parallelism. So it kind of fits with our parallelism, the two lessons that we had on it. Usually of Hebrew wisdom, that would be the books like, well, of course, wisdom would be, of course, Proverbs, but we have wisdom in other of the books of the Bible. So it would be Proverbs and books like Proverbs. And there's Proverbs scattered out throughout other books in the Old Testament. And so it's used of a byword, a prophetic figurative discourse, simile, parable, poem. That's Strong's number H4912, if you want to look that up. He said this. That which is used for comparison purposes is always an event that either could or did happen. So that's important that we kind of keep in mind. And it's something that's usually well known by the audience. So it's well known by the audience. The events discussed in a parable are never physical impossibilities. That would be a fable, not a parable. Comparison is explicit, with the explanation being kept separate from the comparison. So he makes a comparison that's very explicit, comes right out and says it, and then we have to draw an explanation of it, and that's separate from the comparison itself. And there was no falsehood in a parable. Again, that would be a fable. There are a couple of fables in the Bible. It's someone that made it up, and they're not speaking as prophets. Okay, so God never used fables for any of his teaching. Every event can be taken literally and not contradict any natural law or laws of the universe. And keep that in mind. Of trees talking and stuff like that. This is important because when we look at Luke 16, 19 through 31, that's important for interpretation of it. And the soul of man does not sleep, as some argue and say that this was only a parable. Well, even if you allow it and say it's a parable, I don't think it was, but let's assume it is just for the sake of argument. Then the soul doesn't sleep. This would teach that the soul doesn't sleep. And as some argue and say that this is only a parable. Sleeping, I believe, is a false doctrine. Now, there was a certain rich man, and he was clothed in purple and fine linen, faring sumptuously every day. And a certain beggar named Lazarus was laid at his gate full of sores, desiring to be fed with the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Yea, even the dogs came and licked his sores. It came to pass that the beggar died, and that he was carried away by the angels into Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, seeing Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I'm in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now here he is comforted, and thou art in anguish. Besides all this, Between us and you, there's a great gulf fixed, that they that would pass from thence to you may not be able, and that none may cross over from thence to us. And he said, I pray thee, therefore, Father, that thou wouldest send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brethren, that they may testify unto them, lest they come into this place. They also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one go to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto them, if they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded one arise from the dead. Just to look at this, they don't explicitly say this is a parable. Remember, keep that in mind. I don't believe that it's a parable. Assuming it is, however, everything in it could have happened, just as Jesus told him. Even if you argue that it's a parable, that doesn't prove that the things that are used for the illustration could not or did not happen. And it's the only parable that we know of, if it's a parable, where a person is named. It doesn't conform to the characteristics of parables. But we can glean the following truths from this passage. The soul of man does not sleep from death to the judgment, even if it is a parable, because it always took something that could or did happen. Soul does not go directly to heaven between death and the judgment. So that we learn that since the rich man knew Lazarus, it follows that we will know each other in heaven after we die. Soul of man is alive even after the body dies. These are truths we learn from it, even if it's not a parable. The events after death, and here's one reason I think it couldn't be a parable, wouldn't be a parable, is the events after death are veiled from our view, except to the revelation of God's will. Therefore, it's not a common event upon which to base a parable. All the other parables, if this is a parable, it's different than other parables because it takes something that is way beyond our present knowledge. And it gives us information that we don't find anywhere else, even in the scriptures. So it provides that information. Neither does this fulfill the criteria given under the outline on how to determine if language is figurative or literal. So the literal sense. Now, let's look at all the parables. And I think the rich man and Lazarus is not a parable. But even if it is, it would follow these rules. There is a literal sense called the protosis. And the PRO is the word pro, and that's a Greek preposition meaning before. Tosis is something placed. So it is something placed before. Protosis must fit some truths of life or fact of nature. So it always takes some truth of life or some fact of nature that we see. So there's nothing in the protosis, the literal sense, that would be untrue. Then there's an explanation of the mystical sense. It's called, I hate to use the word mystical, but the various writers use it. I would argue it's just an explanation. And the mystical has to do with a mystery, the revealing of a mystery, called the apodosis. And the Greek preposition apo, the first 3 letters, is the word from, and then dosis, and that is something given before. Okay, so it's an explanation from it. I'm sorry, protosis before, placed before it, set before it. Apodosis is the from it. It's something, a lesson learned from it. Better named the spiritual application. I would just call it the spiritual application of the parable. Hypothesis must be deduced. We must use our powers of reasoning to deduce it. Then there is the third part of the parable is the scope. If you talk about the scope, it's talk about looking at things. The Greek word scopos is to view or look at. Our English words telescope, microscope, both come from this word. And both of these come from two Greek words, telos. Telescope is teleo, telos, and teleo is the verb form. And this to the end, in scope to see the end of something, the distant. And microscope is mikros is the Greek word for small, and that's to see something small. The scope, however, is the reason for the parable, and you have to get it from the context. This is the key to understanding the parable. If you don't know the scope of the parable, you may not know the lesson being taught. You have to find the scope to find the lesson. Now let's look at some certain parables that we know are parables. There's the parable of the unmerciful creditor in Matthew 18, verse 23 through 35. The scope of that is forgiveness, and he tells you in the context. So it's talking about, and the lesson has to do with forgiveness. And the parable of the rich fool in Luke 12, verses 16 through 20. The scope of that is covetousness. So the lesson to be learned is on covetousness. But remember that there are two sins that one can commit with money or with possessions, and that would be the sin of covetousness, and that's the sin of acquiring those possessions in a sinful way, cheating people or other things of like nature, taking advantage of someone. A man that would take advantage of a widow when she's in dire straits and purchase her property at less than market value, and that would be a man that would be covetous. A man that would use shady business dealings is covetous to earn money. And the second sin of money is that of course, being stingy with it once you get it, not being willing to use it for God's glory for good. And so that's a miserly type person. That's a lover of money. The lover of money that's what we're talking about there. He loves his money. He's going to keep it. So those are the two. The scope here, I believe, is covetousness. But it could fit in also with being a lover of money. Maybe a combination of both of them. The Good Samaritan, what's it about? But if you look in the context, it answers the question, who is my neighbor? And so we find here that this parable, if you want to talk about a neighbor, you almost got to use this parable as part of your explanation of who a neighbor is. The scope may not be declared. If not, it must be discerned from the context. You must look in the context and see it. Some parables are found more than once in the fourfold gospel, and you'll find them in, say, Matthew and Mark, or Mark and Luke, or Matthew and Luke, or Matthew. And so you'll see parables in maybe more than one of the various accounts of the Lord's life. The scope, and sometimes you'll get some information from one of the parallels. Giving of that parable again. Parables often contain things that are merely the background or dressing of the parable. And to delve off into the background and make a whole lesson on, say, the beast of burden that the Good Samaritan put the injured man on is missing the point. And unless you're taking that beast to be a tool for functioning as a neighbor, and that is, it was a tool for that purpose. The beast of the parable of the Good Samaritan is a part of the background, has little if any to do with the scope of the parable. And it can have something to do with the scope if you understand it's a tool or an instrument to accomplish loving your neighbor, the admonition to love your neighbor. And that would just be any tool that one would use. Of course, the tool must be a lawful tool. You couldn't steal a car to to transport someone and to do things for them when you couldn't steal groceries to give to people, for example. And in order to properly understand the parables, it may be useful to understand the geography or geology of the region or some other facts, customs of the region. It's helpful to understand the nature of various soils, for example, in the parables of the sower. And that's found in 3 accounts, Matthew 3:13, 3 through 6, Mark 4, 3 through 6, and Luke 8, 5 through 8. So when you look at that, you need to understand a bit about soil. And I think it's been misunderstood by some. And the houses of the rock and the sand, wise men build his house on the rock and the sand. So that's kind of a bit of geography, geology. It's useful to understand the history of a region. Knowing history, particularly racial history, is helpful in understanding the parables of the Good Samaritan, for example. And the overcoming of racial prejudice to help the person who really is your neighbor. And that's someone who might not even be of the same race for which you are. And the Pharisee and the publican. This would be social class, racial history and social class. Learn that our acceptance of certain people does not mean that God accepts them. We learn that. Customs may also be valuable to aid to understanding parables. Jewish customs regarding purchasing property helps us to understand the parable of the hidden treasure. And so that we can get that in Matthew 13:44. Understanding marriage customs helps us to understand the parables of the wedding feast. Matthew 22, verses 2 through 14. The bridesmaids and the wedding feast of Luke 14. All of these, when we look at them, we have to understand that we need to get background material. The people to which this parable is given, they understood all of these things. We have to place ourselves not in 21st century world, but back in the first century and study as much as possible their customs. Sometimes it would be very useful to get some books that will give information about the customs of the people of that time. Very helpful in interpreting the parables and interpreting other parts of the Bible as well. Any comments or questions there? Other information that helps us to understand these various parables. Shrinkage of new cloth helps us to understand the parable of the new cloth in an old garment. Now, I remember when I was younger, there were jeans that were denim cloth that was sold, and it was a brand called Levi's. It's still sold. It's still sold worldwide. But when I was younger, the Levi's were not sanforized. They weren't pre-shrunk. So when you bought a pair of Levi's, you always had to buy it bigger than you're going to wear. Then you washed it, and when you put it in the washing machine, it would shrink. And usually it would shrink a little bit the second time you washed it, and maybe just a little bit the third time you washed it. They don't do that anymore. They go ahead and sanforize, or they shrink them before they put the cloth into the clothing. But shrinkage of new cloth helps us to understand the parable of the new cloth in an old garment. Now, some of you may be young enough, you don't remember those jeans the Levi's that you had to buy a larger size than you were going to wear. But this is the parables in Matthew 9:16, Mark 2:21, and Luke 5:36. We must not draw conclusions that are not part of the scope of the parable. The unjust steward, we say, cheated his employer. That's the claim here. So we need to look at that more carefully. Must not conclude, however, that we can cheat. If we think he's cheated the employer, we must not conclude that we can cheat our employer. So that's important. I think that parable needs to be looked at more carefully. And we might, if we get to it, and sometime we'll try to do that. The scope of the parable is wisdom to make preparation. That's in Luke 16:8. And his Lord commended the unrighteous steward because he had done wisely for the sons of this world, or for this their own generation, wiser than the sons of the light. So what's it about? It's talking about making preparation. And he's talking about preparation for something that's important, not just preparation to get your food and so forth. But I think he's talking about preparation for serving God and to go to heaven. But that's something we need to look at more carefully. Jesus is not condoning the act of cheating one's employer. So that would be a wrong interpretation of the passage of Scripture. That's my point here. The parable of the tares does not negate other scriptures that command withdrawal from the disorderly. Matthew 13:24-30 and 36-43. I have a commentary on the parable of the tares, and in my book, the second edition of the Great Commission book. And if you don't have that electronic copy of it, I'm going to try to print it as quickly as I can. If you don't have an electronic copy, I'll be happy to send it to you. Paul said to withdraw from the disorderly, and we see this in 2 Thessalonians 3:14. And that passage said, if any man obeyeth not our word by this epistle, note that man, that ye have no company with him to the end that he may be ashamed. And so we find that someone that didn't obey God's word was to be noted, and they would have no company with him. So there are instructions, and this is not the only passage that gives instructions regarding the withdrawal of our fellowship from those who practice sin. In this context, the disorderly people were those who wouldn't work. And we need to be very careful about stretching that to saying a man is disorderly under other conditions. In the context, it's disorderliness in not working and letting everybody else support him, quitting his job and mooching off other people. That's what that is. And so you're to have no company with a Christian who does this, child of God who does this. Any comments or questions? Some will take the word disorderly and make it apply to just any kind of stuff. And we need to be very careful, but I'm not misapplying it. A number of passages command that we withdraw from sinners in the church. And let me point out, the word a person who sins one time is not necessarily a sinner. The word sinner is someone who makes it a practice. And if you get the definition, Thayer's definition of the word, is someone given over to sin. A man who sins one time and then he repents, and maybe 6 months later he commits another sin, he is not a sinner. He has sinned, and sin will cause us to be lost. But a sinner is one who's given over to it. He just repeatedly keeps doing it over and over. He just won't quit it. So there is a difference. He's not given over to it. If he had a weakness, he succumbs to it a month later or a week or two later, in some sense, or some other sin. The parable of the slighted invitation was designed to teach that the Jews would reject Christianity and the Gentiles would become obedient. That's what it's talking about. That's a slighted invitation. When they were brought to the supper, they were converted and added to the church. I believe that's what that parable is about. And he's telling them that. The idea that some hold that this is teaching we should be actively engaged in evangelism by bringing people to Bible classes or the assembly of the church is just not in the parable. Now, I believe in evangelism. I believe that we need to teach people. But we don't want to misapply a parable to get that doctrine out of it. Other passages teach we ought to be active in evangelism. You don't have to take that parable and misuse it. A parable is something thrust or thrown beside something else, for comparison purposes. In the scriptures, it's a story used for comparison. Let me back up. That we find the admonition to help those in prison. And in the context, we get the wrong impression to visit those in prison. To visit someone was to take care of their needs. Prisons back then, when you're put in prisons, you had to have your friends to feed you or you'd die. They didn't supply you with food and clothing. Our prisons in America, you put in prison, you're fed by the government, and you're clothed, and you have a place to stay, but they just put you out and get you out of society. But back then they didn't. And it's talking about a Christian, a fellow believer who's been put in prison. We see that he's fed and clothed and taken care of. That's in the context of the passages about visiting those in prison. And it's not talking about evangelism. Now, we are taught to love our neighbor, and the scriptures teach us to teach the people, and we ought to teach everybody we can. So another passage would teach us that we need to evangelize, and that would include people in prison. We don't have to misapply this passages on visiting those in prison. Parables were always drawn from real life events. Let's go back now. All parables have a literal sense called the protasis, have a spiritual application of the literal sense called the apodosis. All parables have a scope, the reason for the parable. Frequently, we need background information to interpret a parable. Questions? Any comments?